thanks very much for inviting me to be here tonight and to speak to you in what is a very important time in terms of climate change because as Matt has explained, in 27 days' time, the COP, the Conference of the Parties, the United Nations, will meet again in Paris to try and reach a global agreement. I'm a local MEP. I live in Sheffield. I come from Bradford. I don't know where you're all from. I come from West Yorkshire. I lived abroad in Brussels, actually, in the 1990s, and then came back to live in Sheffield in 1991. And I spend my time going, like you MPs go down to London and come back, I go to Brussels or Strasbourg and come back and live in Sheffield. I'm the current chair of the Committee on International Development of the European Parliament. And prior to that, I spent 10 years on the Environment Committee of the Parliament, and we're negotiating climate change legislation, attending the COPs, and being involved in the overall negotiations. I'm now more involved in development policy, but I just want to say that for me, there's no difference between climate policy and development policy, because I know from my work on the ground, particularly in parts of Africa, parts of the small island states, that poverty will never be history unless we tackle climate change. And for me, the fight is those fights are two sides of the same coin. I'm not going to talk about the science of climate change. That's the job of Matt. You've got other scientists who are coming to do that later on. I'm a policy maker, and I think if 99% of scientists tell you that you have a problem, then you should heed their advice. If I went to 100 doctors and 99 told me I had a problem, and one said, I'm not sure whether your problem is caused by this or there is a problem, I'm not sure whether it's caused by this or that, I'd probably go along with the 99 doctors. So I'm going to stick to the politics and the policy making of climate change and why I think it's my job as a politician to act on that and to put in place policies, which I hope you will help us to implement. I was at the last big, there is a COP every year, normally about just before Christmas, but the last major Conference of the Parties was in Copenhagen in December 2009. And I was there as part of the EU negotiating team, and we took to that conference a package of legislation from the European Union. When the UK, for those who are British here, when the UK goes to the climate talks, this is important in the context of our debate on our role in Europe. We don't go as the UK. We go there as part of the EU delegation of 28 countries now. And we go there with a common mandate, shared targets to put our negotiations on the table. In those international climate talks, our counterparts are China, Russia, the United States, Brazil, the G77 countries. And so I think you can see that would be very difficult for one country like the United Kingdom to have much clout in that kind of international fora if we didn't go along as part of the EU delegation. So the EU negotiates targets, package, and goes along as one block to those negotiations. And what I'm going to talk about first, maybe a little bit of context about the climate talks this year, then talk about a bit of history, how we got to Copenhagen, what went wrong in Copenhagen, why we got to go back to Paris and try again, and maybe something about how I feel pessimistic, optimistic about these talks. So this is the last big UN conference of 2015. I don't know how much you know, there's been two other huge UN conferences this year which are very important for all the countries who will be in Paris. The first big conference was in Addis Ababa in July, and it was a conference on financing for development. You might have heard of the Millennium Development Goals. In the year 2000, all the UN countries signed up to deliver targets for international development. Those goals run out in 2015, delivered in some respects, not in others. But this year, so in July this year, the world community got together to discuss how we're going to finance international development policy between now and 2030. Then in September, in New York, just before the General Assembly, there was the UN summit on the Sustainable Development Goals and the global goals. You might have seen there was quite a bit of press coverage around that, though the fact that the Pope was in New York, he went there to support the idea of the global goals. sort of hid the message a bit, because people talked about the Pope being in New York, and not the fact that all world leaders in New York signed up to what we call the global goals, 17 sustainable development goals, which all governments have agreed to work towards between now and 2030. And the reason that New York was important in terms of climate talks, in the past, the United Nations has worked along the idea of we have some policies for development, we've got some for social things and jobs, and we've got some for environment. And the Sustainable Development Goals, the global goals, bring together all those tracks into one UN process. So people might know about the Earth Summit, the Rio Summit, the MDGs, all those tracks are brought together in New York. And so the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, the global goals, if you Google global goals, you'll see Stephen Hawking talking about them, were signed up to. And the Paris COP, that's happening in 3 weeks' time, is a key part of whether or not the world is going to have a sustainable future. Because unless you tackle climate change, frankly, the rest is for the birds, really. So Paris is our first test. Are world leaders serious about working together to secure the future of the planet, or is it business as usual and more of the kind of warming that Matt just spoke about? So how did it all start? Well, it started with science, and it started back in the 1990s. And the first attempt to get a legally binding global agreement was the Kyoto Protocol. People have heard of Kyoto Protocol. Signed in the first COP, the first meeting was in 1995. The Kyoto Protocol was signed in 1997. It was one of the first acts, I'm a Labour politician, it was one of the first acts of the Labour government. John Prescott was actually led our negotiating team in Kyoto. We got the agreement. And how Kyoto worked, it took what Matt said, it took this idea, the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, a network of scientists, not a few scientists. You often hear, oh, there's a few scientists. No, it's a network of scientists who were involved in global collaboration. There might be some of you even involved in IPCC projects. Certainly in Leeds University, I've met scientists working for the IPCC, drawing up some of the data. So the scientists, the IPCC, looking at potential for climate change, making a calculation of what the world global warming will look like in the next century, and coming to the conclusion we must keep it a maximum 2 degrees above pre-industrial times. The world should not be allowed to warm more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial times. In other words, we can't get back to a world as cool as it was before industrial times. That horse has bolted. But we've got to try and contain the growth, what Matt was talking about. Now, people are saying it's 2 degrees enough, but frankly, in the world of politics, 2 degrees is ambitious. I don't know if you want, there's plenty of room. If you want to come, please come sit down. Don't feel, I can see seats here. You watch people standing at the back there. So how Kyoto worked was countries were asked to sign up, all the countries in the UN signed up to the pledges, and then there were commitment periods. So the United Nations, the plan was to work out what it would take to reach the 2-degree target, and then with burden sharing across the globe to meet the target. That was how it would work. There'd be commitment periods. First commitment period, 2005, 2012. Second commitment period, 2012 onwards. And bit by bit, global temperatures would start going down as emissions went down. That was the plan back in 1997. But we had a problem. The president who signed up, US president who signed up to Kyoto was Clinton. He signed up in 1997. Those who know American politics know that meant in 1998, who got elected in the United States? George W. Bush. George W. Bush is a climate denier, surrounded by climate deniers. So although Clinton signed up to it, it was never ratified by the US Congress. That was the first problem. So that was a major setback. And so in the period between 1997 and 2005, the first commitment period, not as many countries signed up as should have. And the Kyoto Protocol did not make the kind of progress that it should have done. But there was hope, because there was a second commitment period coming in 2012. And so the idea was, okay, this period's not been great, but we'll work towards 2012. And hence, Copenhagen is chosen in 2009 as the date for the next big push on global warming. The EU kept faith with Kyoto. It started having EU-wide targets for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. And when we went to Copenhagen in 2009, the EU was the only part of the world that had targets backed up by laws to deliver them. And we had what we call the 2020 targets. That was a 20% cut in emissions compared to the base year is 1990 for the protocol, always 1990 for the Kyoto Protocol. So you measure everything in relation to 1990. So the base year, 1990, 20% cut in emissions compared with 1990, 20% target of renewable energy. So the whole EU should increase its renewable energy share to 20%, and a 20% energy efficiency target. And those targets were shared with the national burden sharing. So the UK, for example, would have to go up from 1.9% to 15% renewable energy share by 2020. And all the countries of the EU share, we had a burden sharing mechanism. That's legally binding to this date. And the EU has seen its emissions gone down. In fact, we're ahead of schedule now to meet our emission cuts by 2020. There has been a downturn in the economy for those as well, which did affect that target. But compared with other regions of the world, we were doing okay. But we have to remember that the run-up to Copenhagen, this is where the politics comes in. It was kind of different times. You know, the period between 2000 and 2009, we were in a period of economic growth. In the EU, we had 3% growth. We were outpacing the US. And it was the era of the Celtic Tiger, the era of massive economic growth in southern Europe. So we just had the EU enlargement. The wall had come down, the Berlin Wall in 1989. In 2004, the Eastern European countries joined the EU. The euro had been launched. It was a kind of optimistic period when people felt they could, you know, and it's in those periods often in politics when people take risks and they say, you know, we can afford this now, we're going to go ahead, we're going to have a big cut in emissions in 2009. And so they went in with great hope. But of course, just before Copenhagen, what happens? Economic crash came. Just in 2008, and the beginnings of the economic crash and its impact did begin to impact on preparations for Copenhagen. Good news was we had a new US president, Obama, elected in 2008, November 2008, and is elected on the ticket of tackling climate change. So we get to Copenhagen in December 2009, brand new American president, fluttering his stardust everywhere. Everyone wants to meet Obama. Everybody wants to please Obama. Every world leader came to Copenhagen. It was like a celebrity show. But the problem was that the world had changed since the first Kyoto Protocol, and I don't think we'd prepared for that. And I'm saying this because it explains the issue, what is on the table now in Paris. In 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was signed, there was basically seen in terms of climate change to be two kinds of countries. Rich countries that cause the emissions, and poor countries who are suffering the consequences. And the idea of the Kyoto had a twin-track approach, was that there was common and differentiated responsibility. The rich countries were responsible for climate change. They would put money on the table to help poor countries adapt, and they were the ones who would make the biggest reductions. By the time we got to Copenhagen in 2009, it's a different world. The rise of the BRICS, they were called the basics then, Brazil, South Africa, and China. So we had a new type of countries with large emissions, growing economies, were not part of the traditional rich countries, were still seen in UN terms. United Nations negotiates in kind of blocks as G77, as poorest countries. But in Copenhagen, so the old model though started to unravel because the Americans started saying, hang on a minute, we're asking us to make the biggest cuts, we the Americans, yet we've got an economic downturn coming. China's now a competitor for us, so is Brazil, so are some of these Central American countries. India growing. They're the biggest emitters. We're not sure we want to give them a big economic advantage. The basic countries, the new emerging economies, they wanted to flaunt their stuff, be players in the world. The European Union went to Copenhagen with its very well worked out package, everything on the table before the talks, it would lead and others would follow by example. And what happened in the end was that the EU had put everything on the table before the talk started, so they weren't players in the negotiations. They were seen as being out of it before they started because they had nothing to offer more. They'd put everything on the table because they said we will cut whatever anybody else does, we will cut our emissions. The United States started to play hardball, particularly when the Chinese, Brazilians, etc. were playing hardball with them. And so we ended Copenhagen without a global agreement of the kind imagined when we started. We got something called the Copenhagen Accord, which is the basis for the Paris Agreement, but it's not the same as what was originally planned. Because what was originally planned was we would take the science, we would then, as I said before, we take the science and we then burden share to reach the scientific 2-degree target. Instead, since 2009, countries have gone away and they've said, we don't want this top-down approach to the United Nations telling us what to do. We will go away, we will look at our economies, and we will work out what we can pledge towards a UN goal of cutting emissions. And that's where we are now today. And that's what the big discussions are in Paris. So the other mistake in Copenhagen, I think, was that all the world leaders came, but they all got invited at the end of the summit. So imagine these negotiations don't just happen in 3-4 days in Paris. They're happening all the time. There's been a big meeting last week in Bonn. There's a meeting of ministers next week. They've got preparatory meetings happening. Normally the leaders get there and it's all sorted out. But in Copenhagen, everybody waited to the last minute. The leaders came on the last 2 days and there was too much stuff to sort out. So that was a mistake in Copenhagen. So where we are today, in terms of Paris, where we are, Copenhagen, the show stayed on the road, but the planet is still warming. It's harder now to reach a 2-degree target than it would have been had we taken action in 2009. That's the first lesson. You've got to do more now than we did then. Each country is coming forward, as Matt has said, with what's called its intended national determined contribution. That means they say what we're prepared to offer. 146 countries have put pledges on the table. There's 195 countries in the United Nations in the negotiations. 146 have put pledges on the table. The current assessment by the United Nations is that they add up to a 2.7% increase in global temperatures. So they don't meet the 2-degree target as the pledges stand at the moment. If you add them all up, all these pledges, if you look into the future. So it's not as good as we would have liked, but unlike Copenhagen and unlike the first Kyoto Protocol, these pledges, we know that the countries are happy to do them because they've developed these pledges. They haven't been given the targets from on high. They cover 86% of all global emissions. And that's 4 times as many emissions as were covered by the Kyoto Protocol. So more countries are prepared to do more. So the next few weeks, we're going to see whether we're going to prepare for Paris. The work's going to go on to look at these targets. There are some problems with them. I mean, the first problem is each country has come with its own pledge. So how do you compare them? The EU pledge, for example, is a 40% emission cut compared with 1990 by 2030. 27% share for renewable energy. But the EU has weakened its renewable energy commitment because in the past, each country had its individual target for renewable energy. We now haven't got that target anymore. The UK government was one of the biggest lobbyists not to have an individual national target for renewable energy. Guess why? Because we're not doing very well on our target. I think that's a big mistake. 28 countries can't have a target that nobody's obliged to meet. It doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, that's the nature of negotiations. So the EU, 20% target for renewable energy, and a 20% target for energy efficiency by 2030. The United States has a pledge this time, didn't have a pledge for Copenhagen, has a pledge now. They're pledging to a 26% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2025, but they're comparing with 2005, not 1990. So you imagine, think about it, United States, by 2005, emissions are much higher than they were in 1990. So to get to the emission, it's less than the EU. So how do you compare that with the EU target? China has got a different approach. China's going to peak emissions by 2030. So because the argument of the BRIC countries is, we're not prepared to stifle our growth because you lot have caused all the problems, you the rich countries. So we want to be able to keep growing, and then we will peak, and then we will cut. And they're going to peak by 2030. But they are going to increase their share of non-fossil fuels. In other words, nuclear and renewables. They've made that pledge. India is going to cut its energy intensity, it's a different model again, by 30% below 2025 levels, of 2005 levels by 2030. So you can see the problem for the people trying to add up all these pledges and see what they come to. And that's what the scientists are trying to do now. And it's not clear at the moment how these things are going to be policed, how we're going to make sure that everyone stays on, keeps in line. Governments come, governments go. Look at the Australians. Tony Abbott, fortunately in my view, has gone, and now we've got a new government in Australia signed up to tackle climate change again. But governments come and governments go. Canada, we've got the same. The new Canadian government will be involved in climate talks, but governments can, over a 15-year period, they change. Our government's changed. So how should we feel about Paris? These are my final comments. How should we feel about it? Optimistic or pessimistic? The good news is a lot more countries are playing ball compared with 2009. They're realising that business as usual causes them problems. In the United States, a lot of it's about pollution, which isn't, of course, the same as greenhouse gas emissions. But in the public mind, they are the same. It's emissions. And so in China, in India, where you can't breathe, and I can see some people here might know that very well, air pollution, huge political problem, it's got to be solved. People know the global warming is causing problems. The United States has used air quality, actually, to win the argument about greenhouse gas emission reductions, which is not, it's a bit odd, but that's what's happened. I think the debate in science is a little bit more muted. I think we're hearing less from the climate deniers scientists, probably because, to be honest, they were pushed by business and interest, lobby interest, really. The BBC finally got the message that every time you have a scientist talking about climate change, you don't have to have one who says it's not true. That's not balance. You don't have somebody saying they're ghosts. And, you have to. The BBC. So that message has finally got through. We've got important campaigns. The divest campaigns are going on. The Leave It in the Ground campaigns. The OECD doing work. Not Greenpeace, but the OECD doing work on subsidies for fossil fuels. If you looked at how much fossil fuel subsidies are given, it's enough to pay for development policy 10 times over. Indonesia cut its subsidy to fossil fuels and found it had lots more money for health and social services. So, in this country, we're debating whether or not to help the wind industry. Look at the subsidy we've got for other forms of energy. So, I think there is a mood that something's going to happen in Paris. And I think leaders understand that something ought to happen. The bad news is all the issues about comparing the targets. Bottom-up approaches are good, gets buy-in, but do they add up to the same thing? What happens if governments change their mind? Everybody's scared of free riders. Why should I do that? I get this all the time. Why should we do this if others don't do the same? That's why it's so important to have a global agreement. Because people are scared. They're scared of competitors getting competitive advantages. If you spend a lot of money cleaning up your industry, your steel industry, then other people don't bother cleaning up their steel industry and they undercut you on the market. And we're having that debate in South Yorkshire at the moment and in the UK. So I don't think we've quite won the argument about economic growth, decoupling that from growth in emissions. I think it's a highly winnable argument, but I don't think we've won it politically with my colleagues or Westminster colleagues. And in our own country, for those who are British, I think we're going a bit backwards. We're seeing us pull back on commitments on renewable energy. We've seen commitments on zero carbon homes go by the wayside. And I think it's a shame because if the decisions taken on power stations, on building new homes, are ones which lock in carbon for a generation to come. You don't build a new power station every 5 minutes. You don't build new houses every 5 minutes. You build a house for a long time. But overall, I think we will get something done. We will see agreement. And I think it is extremely important. I mean, sometimes you go to these great big conferences, the United Nations, 195 countries, there'll be lots of people there, and people say it's all a big expensive kind of jamboree. What does it achieve? But if you've got to think of what's the alternative to the United Nations doing this work, the alternative, first of all, is that countries, instead of talking about the problems they face, actually sit behind their borders, looking over the tops of their borders at each other, confronting each other, rather than in dialogue with each other. So I think it's good that world leaders get together and they talk and they look at the problems. Secondly, it's an important part of the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, where we pledge that nobody will be left behind and all countries will work together to part of our planet. And finally, if we do get a global agreement on climate change, this is maybe where all you come in, then other things will follow. The agreement will mean the legislation will follow in each country. This will mean, for example, that governments will start looking at cutting their emissions. They'll start looking at how we're going to get more renewable energies, how we're going to get more energy efficiency, how we're going to build more greener homes, how are we going to cut our carbon footprint as a nation. And that feeds into science and technology. And that feeds into people who work in transport policy, looking for new transport car industry will change how its cars run. The airline industry, I mean, these already happen, not enough, but we already are seeing changes there. It will feed through into design of buildings, into the way cities are built, into the way our whole society is organised. And it creates a climate for investment for large companies as well. Because what they want more than anything else is actually certainty. If you're a major corporation, what you don't want is people deciding one thing one minute and one thing the next minute. They want this long-term framework where countries sign up, they pledge, and they go on a trajectory to cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So that's another advantage to working together at the United Nations level. So finally, I think I'm very pleased that you at the university have a carbon neutral plan. It fits in very well with the whole concept of Sustainable Development Goals. Each country is going to be asked, by the way, to develop a national plan for sustainable development, which will then feed, and if each country's got to have its SDG plan to present to the United Nations, then presumably David Cameron, who signed that pledge in New York a few weeks ago, and will sign again in Paris in a few weeks' time, will be asking how Sheffield going to meet its targets. I hope the council will be thinking about it, and the universities and the big players here. How are we going to make sure we're part of that plan? And the citizens, of course, we can all play our part in putting pressure on the politicians to change. I mean, people often say to me, we want you to do this and you to do that. But in politics, we have to create climates, political climates within which decisions are easier for politicians to take. When you had in Sheffield, people were wanting to build wind farms. Every night, the local newspaper, The Star, was full of people moaning about wind turbines going up in their areas. Very few people wrote in to say, actually, we need to do this. We need to have different forms of power because we need to have a greener future. Nobody wrote in to say, actually, there's people in Yorkshire, the powerhouse of Britain, who've lived under great big cooling towers for the last 150 years. And they've had to look at that and pylons everywhere. No, let the vocal people be the people who complained. So please, I hope that you will be the vocal people who will be pushing me, pushing David Cameron, pushing your MPs to sign up to climate change in Paris, and then that in the years to come, that you keep pushing them to make sure they deliver on it. So thank you very much.